This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The Walker family ranch lay spread out across the dusty plains of rural Texas, its wooden skeleton weathered by years of relentless sun and unforgiving winds. The land stretched for miles, barren and untamed, a stark reminder of the harshness and isolation that characterized life out here. It was a place bound by tradition, with every rule, every structure, and every relationship held together by invisible but ironclad ties. The family who lived here was large and firmly rooted in values that had scarcely changed over the decades, values that left little room for deviation, or for those who did not fit easily within its narrow confines. At the heart of this world was Cassie Walker, a girl as quiet and inconspicuous as the dry, crackling weeds that lined the paths around the ranch. At 13, Cassie felt worlds apart from her family, a stranger caught between the innocence of childhood and the confusion of adolescence, silently struggling in an environment that offered her no solace, no understanding. She was a girl of delicate features, but her outward fragility belied a mind that churned with deep, unspoken thoughts, reflections that would remain forever hidden from those around her. She was a silent observer in her own home, a quiet shadow slipping through the hallways, watching and listening, yet never truly a part of the life that flowed around her. Cassie's world was one of routine and repetition, each day a mirror of the last, each year a predictable cycle marked by the seasons and the never-ending work that kept the ranch running. Her family valued strength, resilience, and stoicism, qualities they expected her to embrace without question, qualities that Cassie found herself unable to embody. She could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, like a constant, invisible burden that had settled into her bones. Her parents, stoic and unyielding, viewed her as a blank slate upon which they could carve the same ideals that had shaped their own lives. They didn't understand her quietness, her reluctance to participate, or the way she seemed to retreat into herself. In their eyes, Cassie's introspection was a flaw, a weakness, something to be corrected rather than nurtured. The sprawling house was filled with noise, laughter, arguments, commands shouted across rooms, footsteps echoing down long hallways. Yet for Cassie, these sounds blurred together into a kind of white noise, a backdrop of meaningless voices that never truly reached her. She had become adept at navigating this world in silence, her presence so faint that she was often overlooked, invisible in her own home. It was a role she had grown accustomed to, a way to shield herself from the world around her, to observe without being seen. The family, though tightly bound, was marked by layers of unspoken tensions and grievances. Her parents carried the weight of their own unfulfilled dreams, dreams that had been sacrificed to maintain the ranch and uphold the family legacy. Her aunts and uncles, who lived in separate quarters on the property, were locked in their own struggles, battles fought in silence, masked by forced smiles and gestures of false affection. Cassie saw through the pretense, understood the underlying resentment that colored every interaction, and she felt it creeping into her own heart, a quiet poison that deepened her sense of isolation. Cassie's relationship with her parents was defined by expectation and disappointment, a continuous cycle that left her feeling hollow. Her mother, a stern woman with a perpetually tired expression, regarded her daughter with a mixture of confusion and frustration. She didn't understand Cassie's quietness, her refusal to speak her mind or assert herself. To her mother, Cassie's reluctance to fit into the family mold was a failing, something that reflected poorly on her as a parent. Her father, a man of few words, looked at her with a silent expectation that she would one day fall in line, that her rebellion was just a phase that would pass with time. But Cassie felt that it was no phase. She knew, in some deep, unnameable part of herself, that she could never be the person they wanted her to be. As the days passed, Cassie's resentment grew, a quiet, simmering rage that she kept locked away, hidden even from herself. She could feel it building within her, a dark cloud that tainted her thoughts and filled her dreams with images she could barely comprehend. The life she lived felt suffocating, like a prison with walls that closed in around her, leaving her no room to breathe, no space to be herself. Her family's voices echoed in her mind, each word a reminder of her failure to meet their standards, to embody the qualities they held so dear. She was not resilient, she was fragile. She was not obedient, she was quietly defiant. And in this family, there was no room for weakness, no tolerance for defiance. At night, when the house was quiet and the Texas sky stretched out above her like an endless dark void, Cassie would lie awake, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't voice. She felt like an outsider in her own life, a girl trapped in a world that held no understanding of who she was or who she wanted to be. She imagined escaping, running away from the ranch, from the expectations and the relentless, unending demands of her family. But even in her dreams of freedom, she felt a sense of hopelessness, a recognition that there was nowhere for her to go, no place where she would truly belong. In those quiet, lonely hours, Cassie's thoughts would turn dark, her mind exploring possibilities that she knew were dangerous, forbidden. She began to imagine a world in which her family no longer held power over her, a world in which she was finally free to live without their judgment, without their oppressive love. The images that filled her mind were troubling, frightening even, but they brought her a sense of comfort, a feeling of control that she had never experienced in her real life. She clung to these fantasies, even as she recognized the darkness that lay within them, the unsettling hunger they awoke in her. Slowly, over time, the fantasies began to feel less like dreams and more like possibilities. She started to see her family not as people, but as obstacles, as symbols of the life that trapped her, the life she felt powerless to escape. The resentment that had once been a quiet, simmering presence in her heart grew into something sharper, something that demanded action. She felt herself hardening, her emotions crystallizing into a single, unyielding desire, a desire to break free, to tear down the walls that held her captive, to silence the voices that filled her mind with expectations and disappointments. The ranch, once a place of stability and tradition, now felt like a cage, its wide-open spaces closing in on her, suffocating her with their familiarity. She saw her family not as a source of support or love, but as a force that held her captive, a force that had stripped her of her sense of self. And in the stillness of her heart, she began to feel a terrible, exhilarating resolve, a sense that her freedom lay within her own hands, that the power to escape was hers to wield. Cassie's quiet life, her silent rebellion, had set her on a path she could barely understand, a path marked by anger, isolation, and a growing sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she could not go on living as she had, bound by the expectations and demands of a family who saw her as nothing more than a reflection of themselves. She felt herself drifting further from them, her heart hardening, her resolve solidifying into something unbreakable. In the quiet of her mind, Cassie began to plan. She didn't know where her thoughts would lead her, or what the consequences might be, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she could no longer live under the shadow of her family's expectations. Cassie's resentment became a kind of constant companion, a weight that bore down on her each day, as though she carried a stone within her chest. At first, she didn't recognize its full shape or meaning. It was merely a vague discomfort, an unease that colored her interactions, making each family meal and every morning chore feel like a burden she could barely tolerate. Her family could see nothing wrong. They dismissed her silence as typical adolescent moodiness, oblivious to the darker thoughts taking root within her. Each day brought more moments that added to her discontent, more careless remarks, more offhand judgments that drove her further into herself. Her family's words came like stinging blows, subtle but deep, striking at parts of her she couldn't defend. When they told her she was too sensitive or too quiet, they might as well have been telling her she wasn't worthy, that her existence in its raw form was something defective, in need of fixing. The expectation that she conformed to their image of the obedient daughter only made her feel more alien, a creature apart from the people who claimed to know and love her. One morning, she was assigned the task of feeding the animals, a duty she had performed countless times before. As she moved among the livestock, the bleakness of her surroundings seeped into her consciousness, the barn's earthy smell mingling with the loneliness that always seemed to hover around her like a shadow. She watched the chickens scurry away, observed the blank, indifferent gaze of the cattle, and for the first time felt a profound kinship with them. She realized with a startling clarity that she, too, was penned in, fenced off from any real sense of freedom or purpose. Her life was a series of tasks imposed by others, by people who saw her only as a cog in their family machinery, with no will or desires of her own. The animals became a bitter metaphor, each one representing a facet of her own existence. Like them, she was fed, clothed, and given the appearance of care, but her spirit was bound, hemmed in by the demands of a life she had not chosen. As she moved among the stalls, her resentment solidified into something darker, more potent, a silent vow that she would not live her life like them, tied to a role she despised. Her family only amplified this feeling. The aunts and uncles, who lived in adjoining wings of the ranch, all shared the same unyielding values, the same fixation on work, discipline, and obedience. Cassie found herself suffocating beneath their watchful eyes, feeling as though her every movement was under surveillance. They spoke to her in tones of casual authority, their voices heavy with judgment, as though it were their right to shape her life. to decide her future. Each conversation, each directive, only confirmed her belief that she would never be free here. Gradually, she noticed her resentment turning outward, no longer contained within her thoughts. It began to spill into her movements, her gestures. She became sharper, her actions tinged with a subtle aggression that she struggled to control. The breaking point was not a single event, but a slow, painful realization that bloomed within her over weeks, even months, like a storm gathering strength. She could feel herself hardening, each moment of forced compliance forging a layer of bitterness that cloaked her emotions, her thoughts, her very identity. Her mother was a particularly harsh catalyst, her words always laced with a cutting disappointment. She would make observations about Cassie's appearance, her lack of friends, her tendency to withdraw. To her mother, these were flaws to be corrected, signs that Cassie was struggling to grow up. Holding herself back, her mother saw her quiet nature as a weakness, something to be scolded away or reshaped into an image of her choosing. With each comment, each critique, Cassie felt a piece of herself shrivel, shrink further inward. It was as though her mother's disapproval carved away parts of her, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell of the girl she might have been. One evening, at the family dinner table, her father made a remark that sliced through her with particular cruelty. He spoke about the importance of strength in the Walker family, how each generation had persevered, overcoming challenges with resilience and resolve. He didn't need to point directly at her for her to know his words were meant for her, a reminder that she was somehow lesser, a person lacking the fortitude that defined their bloodline. It was a subtle condemnation, delivered with the quiet authority of a father's expectations, but it shattered something deep within her, like a stone hurled through glass. She felt a sudden, visceral surge of anger, a need to shout, to scream, to make them see the person she truly was. But she said nothing, only clenched her fists beneath the table, letting the rage fester and grow. As days passed, Cassie found herself retreating more and more into her own mind, into the dark and twisted fantasies that offered her an escape, a place where she could finally exist on her own terms. She imagined a world where her family was silent, where she could roam the ranch without the weight of their expectations pressing down upon her. These fantasies began as fleeting thoughts, mere glimpses of a life free from their authority, but they grew in intensity, becoming her refuge, her source of strength. In these moments she felt powerful, liberated from the constraints of reality, free to envision a life that was hers alone. But these fantasies were not enough. Each time she returned from the world within her mind, the reality of her life felt more unbearable, more confining. She felt trapped in an endless loop, each day a repetition of the last, each interaction a reminder of her powerlessness. The anger within her grew sharper, more defined, transforming from a vague resentment into a concrete force that drove her forward. She began to see her family not as individuals, but as obstacles, barriers that stood between her and the life she craved. In this state, Cassie became almost mechanical, moving through her daily routines with a detached efficiency. She observed her family with an emotionless clarity, studying their habits, their vulnerabilities, noting the rhythms of their lives. It was as though she had become a different person, someone who could watch them with a cold, analytical gaze, unaffected by the love or loyalty that might have bound her to them before. She felt herself drifting further from them, her heart encased in an armor of her own making, fortified by her silent resolve. The breaking point was not a single act or a sudden explosion of rage, but rather a quiet, steady erosion of everything she had once known. It was the result of 1,000 small wounds, each one deepening her isolation, each one chipping away at her sense of connection, until there was nothing left but the hollow echo of her own anger. She felt as though she had been emptied out, stripped of her innocence, her empathy, left only with the cold certainty that she could not, continue as she had. Cassie's transformation was complete. The fantasies that had once been her solace now became her reality, shaping her thoughts, guiding her actions. She felt a strange calm settle over her, a detachment that allowed her to view her family as though from a great distance, as though they were strangers she had merely observed, rather than people who had once been central to her life. She felt no remorse, no guilt, only a quiet determination, a single-minded focus that drove her forward with a clarity she had never known before. The breaking point was not a moment of release, but a moment of acceptance. Cassie understood, finally, that her freedom would not be granted by anyone else. It was something she would have to take, something she would have to seize with her own hands. And as she looked out across the vast, empty landscape of the ranch, she felt a strange, exhilarating sense of peace wash over her, as though she were standing on the brink of something new, something that would finally bring her the freedom she had so desperately craved. In the depths of her heart, Cassie knew she was ready. The anger, the bitterness, the sense of isolation, all of it had prepared her for this moment, forging her into someone strong, someone unbreakable. She had reached the end of her patience, the end of her tolerance for the life she had been forced to endure. And as she embraced the darkness within her, she felt a powerful, unshakable certainty that her path was set, that her fate was inevitable. The time had come to break free. The night had a strange stillness to it, a silence that seemed to blanket the ranch, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Cassie moved through the shadows like a specter, her steps deliberate, her heart steady, her mind calm. Every sound was amplified in the dark, the rustle of leaves in the faint wind, the creak of the old wooden floor beneath her weight. But Cassie's own movements were silent, careful, as if she had trained for this moment her whole life. She felt detached from herself, as if she were watching her body move from somewhere far above, observing a girl who had been stripped of fear, of hesitation, of anything that might restrain her from the path she had chosen. In her mind, everything was clear. She could no longer see her family as flesh and blood, as people with voices and memories, people who might once have loved her. They had become symbols, representations of a life she had spent too long despising. They were her prison walls, the relentless barriers that had hemmed her in, that had told her she was small and powerless, weak and inadequate. But tonight she would shatter those walls. Tonight she would erase them from her world and emerge on the other side, reborn, unbound. She knew every inch of the house, every corner, every creaking floorboard, every hallway that opened into darkened rooms. She knew which doors were loose, which hinges would groan under pressure, which lights would flicker in the early hours. It was her home, after all, a place she had spent her life studying, silently moving through as an observer rather than a participant. And in that knowledge she found her strength. She was the keeper of the house's secrets, the silent overseer who could walk through the darkness with ease, unhindered by the fear that might stop someone else. The plan had unfolded in her mind slowly, meticulously. It was as if her thoughts had been leading her here all along, coaxing her toward this night with whispers of quiet insistence. She had considered every detail, weighed every possible obstacle, mentally mapping her actions like the moves of a deadly game. She knew where each member of her family would be, what their habits were, which rooms they would retreat to in the quiet hours. She had watched them for years, unknowingly preparing for this very moment, observing their weaknesses, noting their routines. She had become the ultimate observer, invisible and unnoticed, moving through their lives like a ghost. And now, she would use that invisibility to erase them from her world. Cassie began with her parents' room. Her steps were soundless, her hands steady as she entered, her heart filled with an emotion she couldn't fully name. It wasn't anger anymore that had dissipated long ago, leaving only a cold, unfeeling detachment. She moved with a precision that felt inhuman, each step calculated, each movement measured. She saw her parents as they were silent figures lost in sleep, unaware, defenseless. For a brief moment she wondered if she should feel something more guilt, perhaps, or regret. But there was only emptiness, a vast, cold stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly within her. The act itself was swift, carried out with an efficiency that surprised even her. She had always been meticulous, careful, but this was something else, a kind of ruthless clarity that guided her hands, her body, her thoughts. She felt as though she were acting out a ritual, a predetermined sequence of events that had been waiting for her all along. The silence afterward was profound, heavy, a reminder that she was alone, that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. One by one she moved through the house, the darkness around her pressing close, thick and absolute. She felt a strange calmness settle over her as she made her way from room to room, a calmness that was both foreign and familiar, as though it had been waiting for her beneath the surface all her life. Each member of her family was another barrier, another weight that had held her down, and with each act, she felt herself grow lighter, freer, as though the burden she had carried for so long was slowly lifting from her shoulders. The rooms were silent witnesses to her actions, each one holding its breath as she moved through them, leaving traces of herself in the dark. She felt a strange kinship with the shadows, as though they understood her, as though they had been watching her all along, waiting for her to join them. The darkness seemed to embrace her, to fold around her like a shroud, hiding her from the light, from the scrutiny of the world beyond. She was no longer Cassie, the quiet girl trapped by her family's expectations. She was something else now, something larger, something powerful. There was a moment when she paused, standing in the hallway, her breath steady, her mind as clear as ice. She realized that she felt no fear, no hesitation. The girl she had been, the girl filled with anger and resentment, with the bitterness of 1,000 small wounds, was gone. In her place was a person she did not entirely recognize, someone who had stepped out of the shadows and embraced the darkness with open arms. She was a vessel of silence, of emptiness, carrying out a purpose that transcended her own understanding. The final rooms were almost an afterthought, each step leading her further into the calm emptiness she had created. The silence was complete now, filling the house, pressing against the walls, saturating every corner. It was a silence that she had longed for, a silence that marked the end of her suffering, the end of her anger. She felt a sense of peace that was unlike anything she had ever known, a stillness that settled deep within her, soothing her, comforting her. When it was done, she stood alone in the middle of the house, surrounded by the remnants of her actions, the weight of her choices settling over her like a blanket. She was free now, she realized, in a way she had never thought possible. The walls that had once imprisoned her had fallen away, leaving her standing in a world that was entirely her own. She was alone, truly alone, and in that solitude she found a strange, intoxicating liberation. The house was transformed. It no longer felt like a prison, no longer held the echoes of voices that had once condemned her, belittled her, bound her to a life she had despised. It was silent, utterly silent, the air thick with a kind of sacred stillness. She breathed it in, felt it settle within her, and knew that she had finally become what she was always meant to be. She was no longer a prisoner, no longer a shadow cast by her family's expectations. She was free, an empty vessel standing in the quiet aftermath of her own choices. As she stood there, Cassie felt a strange sense of finality, as though she had reached the end of a long, twisted journey that had been waiting for her all along. She was beyond remorse, beyond regret. She was a part of the darkness now, inseparable from it. A silent figure standing in the quiet aftermath of her own liberation. The world she had created in her mind, the world free from her family's control, had finally become real, and she felt herself dissolve into it, becoming one with the silence, with the stillness. The night around her was calm, almost gentle, the stars scattered across the sky like distant memories, watching her from above. The vast Texas landscape stretched out before her, empty and quiet, a dark expanse that seemed to mirror the emptiness within her. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, looking out over a world she had only dreamed of, a world she had finally claimed as her own. And in that moment she understood that she was no longer the girl she had once been, no longer Cassie Walker, the quiet, forgotten daughter. She was something else entirely, something nameless and powerful, a silent force standing in the darkness, forever alone. The morning after the massacre, the Walker Ranch lay eerily silent, bathed in the soft, indifferent light of dawn. From a distance it looked as it always had, an isolated sprawl of dusty land and weathered wood, standing against the vast emptiness of rural Texas. But something in the air felt different, a tension barely perceptible yet impossible to ignore. A ranch hand, arriving early to begin his daily tasks, sensed it immediately, a feeling that settled over him like a shadow as he approached the main house. The stillness was too complete, the usual sounds of morning, the murmur of voices, the clink of dishes, the hum of activity entirely absent. When he entered, the silence closed in around him, oppressive and all-encompassing, like a force that had taken over the house. His footsteps echoed too loudly against the wooden floor, and with each step, a sense of dread rooted itself deeper within him. Room by room, he saw the scenes of horror unfold, an unthinkable reality that twisted his perception of the familiar surroundings. He could not comprehend what lay before him, the still bodies, the eerie quiet that hung over everything like a dark veil. Shock turned to terror, and he stumbled out of the house, his mind unable to process the images that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first responders arrived in a haze of flashing lights and urgent footsteps, but as they crossed the threshold into the Walkers' home, their confidence and composure melted away. They were used to the occasional accident, the sporadic violence that touched even small towns, but this was beyond anything they had ever encountered. Each room bore witness to the same silent devastation, a brutal scene frozen in time. It was as though the house had been transformed into a monument to human darkness, a place where even the air seemed stained with violence. The officers moved through the house with reverent caution, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the horror of what they were witnessing. They could feel the weight of each step, the thick, heavy silence pressing down on them, forcing them to confront the incomprehensible. They exchanged glances, communicating in silence, each of them wondering how a single person could have inflicted such calculated violence. And yet, there was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of resistance. It was as if the massacre had occurred without sound, without warning, each life snuffed out in the stillness of night. As the investigators combed through the evidence, piecing together the events of the previous night, the realization began to dawn upon them, a chilling understanding that seeped into their bones. The possibility that this horror could be the work of a mere child seemed too monstrous to entertain, and yet the facts refused to align in any other way. They found no evidence of an intruder, no sign of forced entry, nothing to suggest that anyone outside the family had been involved. Instead, what they discovered pointed to someone inside, someone who knew the layout of the house intimately, who understood the family's routines and vulnerabilities. The townspeople were the next to feel the tremors of the crime. News spread slowly at first, whispered in hushed tones, as if speaking it aloud might give it greater power. The town was small, and each family connected in some way to the Walkers. People spoke of the family with a mixture of shock and disbelief, struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of the tragedy. The once solid foundation of their quiet lives had been fractured, leaving a gaping wound in the fabric of their community. The Walker family had been a pillar of tradition, embodying the values and resilience that so many in the town had looked up to. Now, their legacy lay in ruins, a dark and twisted tale that overshadowed everything they had once represented. The children, too young to understand fully, sensed the tension in their parents' voices, the fear that flickered in their eyes. They saw the adults gather in somber clusters, their voices low and grim, as though some great and ancient curse had descended upon them. Questions floated in the air, unspoken yet pressing, echoing in the minds of everyone who had known the Walkers. How could this have happened? How could one of their own, a child, have done such a thing? The investigators, driven by both duty and disbelief, sought answers that eluded them. They scrutinized every inch of the ranch, searching for any detail that might explain the unimaginable violence that had taken place within those walls. They examined footprints, traced fingerprints, documented each piece of evidence with painstaking care. But what they found only deepened the horror. There were no signs of desperation, no attempts to cover tracks, no evidence of a mind overtaken by panic. The precision and calmness of each act suggested something cold and calculated, a level of detachment that left the officers shaken to their core. The discovery of Cassie's belongings, a notebook filled with scrawled thoughts, cryptic drawings that hinted at a world of anger and isolation, only served to deepen the mystery. Her entries were disjointed, fragments of thoughts that revealed glimpses into a mind darkened by resentment, yet somehow frighteningly lucid. Her words carried a chilling finality, an acceptance of the violence she had inflicted, as though her actions were not a sudden outburst, but the culmination of a long, deliberate journey. The investigators pored over these entries, their own minds grappling with the darkness that Cassie had carried within her, a darkness that had gone unseen by those closest to her. The ranch became a place of uneasy pilgrimage, a sight that both repelled and attracted those who had known the family. People would drive by, their eyes lingering on the house, their minds filled with questions that would never be answered. They spoke of Cassie in whispers, her name invoked like a ghostly presence, a reminder of the potential for darkness that lay hidden within even the most familiar of faces. Parents held their children closer, glancing at them with new eyes, wondering if they too could harbor thoughts and emotions that would remain forever hidden. The town mourned the Walkers, but it was a mourning laced with fear, with a sense of betrayal that left a stain on their memory. They could no longer think of the family as they once had, proud, resilient, woven into the fabric of their community. Instead, they became symbols of a hidden horror, a reminder of the secrets and darkness that can lie beneath even the most wholesome exteriors. The crime changed the town, altering the way its people viewed each other, injecting a new and lingering suspicion into their lives. In the aftermath, the silence that had once defined the Walker Ranch remained, but it had transformed. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a rural homestead. It was a silence charged with dread, a reminder of the unspeakable acts that had been committed within its walls. The house stood as a silent witness, a relic of a nightmare that could never be fully exorcised from the minds of those who had witnessed it. For those who had seen the crime scene, the memories would remain, seared into their minds, unshakable reminders of the fragility of normalcy, of the thin line that separated the familiar from the monstrous. The town would never truly recover, its sense of safety shattered, its trust forever altered. The story of the Walker family would echo through its streets for generations, a cautionary tale whispered among the children, a haunting legend that would remind them all of the darkness that can lie hidden, even within the most innocent of souls. The days following the discovery of the massacre brought a tidal wave of questions and speculation that engulfed the entire town, drowning it in an eerie mix of dread and fascination. It was impossible to reconcile the image of Cassie Walker young, quiet, with her soft, unassuming presence with the horror that had unfolded at her hands. The question of how she, a mere child, could commit such an atrocity became an obsession, a puzzle that everyone felt compelled to solve, yet few were willing to face head-on. The investigation intensified, moving deeper into Cassie's life and mind, each detail unsettling those who uncovered it. Police and investigators, accustomed to crime and brutality, found themselves shaken as they examined the evidence of her methodical planning and the dispassionate execution of her actions. Her notebooks became the centerpieces of the investigation, filled with erratic scrawls, sketches, and dark reflections that offered only glimpses of her motives but never the full picture. Reading her thoughts was like peering into a fragmented mind, a place where anger and alienation had metastasized over years, morphing into something impenetrable and chillingly cold. To her family and teachers, her classmates and neighbors, Cassie had seemed distant, yes, perhaps even withdrawn, but never dangerous, never capable of such unspeakable acts. And yet, as they looked back, they began to see signs they had missed, tiny moments that now took on a dreadful new meaning. They remembered her silent stares, the way she sometimes lingered in the background, watching others with an intensity that had seemed shy, but was now impossible to interpret as anything but disturbing. They recalled her tendency to avoid eye contact, the quiet way she moved through life like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarkable, yet somehow always observing. How had they failed to see what was simmering just beneath her surface? Each new revelation felt like an assault, a reminder that the familiar could become monstrous, that even a child could harbor darkness beyond comprehension. People who had known Cassie felt their sense of self unraveling, as if their understanding of human nature itself had been shattered. For parents especially, there was a deep, gnawing fear, a terror of what they might not know about their own children. They began to question everything, casting wary glances at their own families, wondering if they too might be blind to something hidden and dangerous. As word of Cassie's journal spread, the town found itself confronting the unsettling reality of her thoughts. Her entries revealed a girl estranged from the world around her, lost in an inner darkness that had gradually consumed her. She had written of her isolation, her sense of being trapped, of living under the weight of expectations she could never meet. But more than anything, she had written of the resentment, the rage that had grown within her like a storm, gaining strength with each passing day. Reading her words, those who had known her felt an icy chill, a realization that the person they thought they knew had been a mask, a carefully maintained facade concealing an alien mind they could never hope to understand. Investigators continued to peel back layers of Cassie's life, tracing the roots of her anger, her transformation from a quiet, withdrawn child to something terrifyingly cold. Teachers remembered small incidents, moments when Cassie had seemed on the edge of anger, her gaze fierce yet contained, always retreating before it boiled over. Friends recalled times when she had seemed unreachable, staring off as if lost in a world only she could see, her thoughts inaccessible, her emotions tightly bound. Now, with hindsight, they wondered if these were the signs, the clues they should have seen, hints of a tragedy waiting to unfold. For her father, the truth was a crushing weight, a reckoning he could barely bring himself to face. As he looked at her belongings, her childhood photos, he struggled to reconcile the child he had raised with the person revealed in her journals and actions. The investigation's findings were laid before him with cold precision, each detail meticulously outlined, each piece of evidence adding to a truth that felt like a physical blow. He thought back to the moments he had missed, the times he had dismissed her silence as shyness, her distance as a natural part of growing up. In his own memories, he saw a little girl who had once clung to him, who had sought his approval, his love. How had that child become this stranger, capable of such cold brutality? The townspeople, too, struggled to come to terms with the knowledge that Cassie, one of their own, had been the architect of such horror. They wanted to reject the truth, to find another explanation, but the facts were unyielding, undeniable. They clung to memories of her as a quiet, introspective girl, a child who had seemed ordinary, innocent. But the truth gnawed at them, forcing them to confront the possibility that darkness could fester even in the most unassuming places. As they went about their daily lives, an unease settled over the town, a suspicion that cast shadows over their once close relationships. The psychologists brought in to analyze Cassie's writings offered clinical explanations for her behavior, talk of trauma, isolation, and mental health struggles. They spoke of the pressure she must have felt, the way years of silence and suppressed anger had twisted her sense of self, leading her down a path that none could have foreseen. But these explanations felt hollow, inadequate in the face of such incomprehensible violence. There was a profound discomfort in the town, a sense that the simple language of psychology could never fully capture the depths of what had happened. They needed to believe that such darkness was rare, that it was something outside the realm of ordinary life, but the reality of Cassie's actions defied all rationalization. As the investigation drew to a close, the town was left with an emptiness, a wound that would not heal. The finality of the truth had settled upon them, heavy and unyielding, like a stain that could not be washed away. The Walker Ranch remained empty, a silent witness to the tragedy that had forever altered the lives of those who lived nearby. People avoided the place, unable to shake the feeling that it was haunted not by ghosts, but by the knowledge of what had taken place there. They spoke of it in hushed voices, as though mentioning it too openly might summon the darkness back into their lives. For those who had loved Cassie, there was no solace, only the enduring question of how they could have failed to see what had been growing within her. They carried a guilt that would stay with them always, a sense that they had been complicit, even unwittingly, in the events that had unfolded. They asked themselves what they could have done differently, how they might have reached her before it was too late. But the truth was a blade that cut deeply, leaving no room for comfort, only a hollow ache that would linger in their hearts. In the end, the town was left not with answers, but with a haunting emptiness, a reminder of the fragility of human connection, the ease with which darkness can take root in unseen places. The truth had come to light, but it brought no closure, only an unsettling awareness of the mysteries that lay hidden in the hearts of those they thought they knew. In the weeks and months that followed the Walker family massacre, the town's sense of identity lay fractured, broken into pieces that would never be mended. For a long time, the tragedy consumed every conversation, every glance exchanged on the street, and every hushed whisper in the school hallways. The quiet town, once a place where everyone knew everyone else, had become haunted by its own memories, struggling under the weight of a trauma that none of them could process, let alone forget. The Walker Ranch itself, once a symbol of tradition and family strength, now stood as a grim monument to a truth that had turned their lives inside out. Dust gathered over the empty house, and weeds crept across the property like tendrils of decay, claiming it as part of the barren landscape that stretched endlessly around it. From a distance, the house looked no different, its familiar silhouette still visible on the horizon, yet up close, it had become an unbearable reminder. People avoided driving past it, children who had once played on its land now veered away, as though it were a place forever cursed. It was as though the house itself absorbed the memory of that night, and even the air around it seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if saturated with the violence and pain that had unfolded within its walls. In the community, trust became a fragile and elusive thing, something that flickered like a weak flame, constantly threatening to go out. Families who had once gathered freely, laughing and exchanging stories, now looked at each other with cautious, uncertain eyes. Parents held their children closer, spoke to them in tones that trembled with worry and fear. Many children, too young to understand the full weight of what had happened, still sensed the change in their parents, in the way they lingered a second longer on each embrace or watched them as they played, fear glinting in their eyes, as if searching for something unknown, something dangerous, lurking beneath their own children's faces. People began to question things they'd once taken for granted. Conversations about family and discipline turned somber, as parents wondered whether they, too, might one day discover something terrible lurking in their children's hearts. Those closest to the Walker family carried an especially heavy burden, feeling the tragedy as a personal failure, as though their connection to the Walkers made them somehow responsible. They spoke less, their voices weighed down by guilt and shame, and the questions that now haunted their every waking thought. How had they not seen it coming? How had they missed the darkness that had apparently been festering in Cassie's mind? Each encounter with another person felt tinged with suspicion, with doubt, as they wondered if there were other secrets buried in the town that had yet to surface. The schools, once a safe space where the children of the town came together to learn and grow, now felt changed, as if the shadows of what had happened had seeped into their walls. Teachers moved cautiously, their interactions with students colored by an unease that none of them could shake. They spoke with greater gentleness, fearful of the hidden struggles that might lie behind each child's silence. Cassie's former classmates were left to grapple with their own confusion and grief, unable to reconcile the girl they had known with the monstrous acts she had committed. They too became withdrawn, their conversations stilted, each of them privately fearing the darkness that might be lurking in others, or even within themselves. The town's collective sense of innocence was shattered, replaced by an awareness of life's unpredictability and a recognition of the darkness that could lie hidden in the most unexpected places. News of the massacre had drawn the eyes of the nation, turning the town into a story for headlines and a subject for journalists. Reporters arrived, bringing with them cameras, questions, and endless scrutiny. They interviewed townspeople, probed into Cassie's life, and wrote with a detached curiosity about the horror that had unfolded in this quiet, forgotten part of Texas. To the world, it was a shocking but distant story, another tragedy in a long line of tragedies. But for those who lived here, it was something they could never escape, something woven into the very fabric of their existence. When the journalists left and the attention faded, the town was left in silence, alone with its grief. A heavy, lingering sadness settled over everything, casting a pall over celebrations, school events, and gatherings that had once been filled with laughter and joy. No one spoke openly about what had happened, but it was always there, a ghostly presence hovering just out of reach, coloring their lives in shades of gray. The town was still and hollow, like a shell of what it had once been, its vibrancy dulled, its spirit forever marked by the tragedy it had endured. Cassie's memory became a taboo, a subject no one dared approach but one that everyone felt lurking in the corners of their minds. In quiet moments, people would reflect on her, a girl they had once seen as ordinary, as someone they might have passed by without a second glance. They thought of her isolation, her silence, and questioned whether they too could have played a part in what she had become. Each family saw a part of themselves in the Walker's story, and in that reflection they found only fear and discomfort, an unwillingness to confront the truths it suggested about their own lives. Years passed, but the town's wound remained open, raw. The younger generations grew up hearing fragments of the story, whispered warnings about the Walker family, told in a mixture of awe and fear. For them, Cassie's story became part of the town's folklore, a dark tale passed down with solemnity and caution, a reminder of the hidden shadows that lay within even the quietest hearts. Parents would recount the story to their children as a cautionary tale, not with the intent of frightening them, but as a way of impressing upon them the weight of actions, the importance of understanding one another, the danger of ignoring what lay beneath the surface. The Walker's massacre became the town's defining scar, a constant reminder of life's fragility and the ease with which darkness could creep into their world. It transformed their sense of identity, their view of human nature, and their understanding of family and trust. They were no longer just a close-knit community bound by shared values and history. They were a town that had come face to face with the darkest parts of the human soul, and that knowledge lingered, haunting their every step, shaping their every thought. As the town moved forward, it did so with the awareness that the wounds from that terrible night would never fully heal. They would always be there, faint yet undeniable, a reminder of the horror that had erupted in their midst, a testament to the brokenness that had been hidden just beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary life. And though the years would soften the sharpest edges of their grief, the memory of the massacre would never fade. It would remain embedded in the land, in the weathered walls of the Walker Ranch, in the shadows that crept across the town at dusk. In the end, the town was left with a hard-won knowledge, a deeper understanding of the complexity and darkness of the human heart. They learned to live with that awareness, even as it changed them, binding them together in shared sorrow and quiet resilience. The tragedy of the Walkers would always be a part of them, a reminder of both the fragility of life and the hidden strength required to carry on. And so they did, each day marked by a solemn acknowledgement of the past, and an unwavering determination to move forward despite the shadows that lingered in their wake.